Welcome to JFK and the Enduring Secret. I'm your host, Jeff Crudell.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode is episode 48, and it's a continuation of episode 47. This is the story of Richard Randolph Carr, and today, in episode 48, we are going to reproduce Carr's entire testimony at the Clay Shaw trial. As I explained in episode 47, there are 5 main actors in this passion play today, and only one of me, so each of those 5 actors will be heard in one of my predefined, somewhat crappy imitation voices as I chronicled them for you in episode 47. So without further ado, let's listen to episode 48. Judge Edward A. Haggerty, Jr. would look down from the bench straight at Mr. Garrison and say, "Call your next witness."
Your Honor, Mr. Carr is unable to walk because of a recent accident, and we understand the defense has no objection if the court will permit to have Mr. Carr wheeled right in front of the state council table.
Judge Haggerty would reply, "That's all right. He can testify from there." Richard Randolph Carr, having been first duly sworn by the minute clerk, was examined and testified as follows.
Mr. Carr, we can hear you if you speak into the microphone, sir, and it's important that the jury be able to hear you and the defense counsel over here, and the court reporter. What is your full name?
Richard Randolph Carr.
And in what city do you live?
Dallas, Texas.
And what city were you living in during the month of November 1963?
Dallas, Texas, 322 North Camden, Oak Cliff.
Can you recall the day of November 22nd, 1963?
Yes.
Can you recall what part of the city you were in around the middle of the day on November 22nd?
Yes. I was on the 7th floor of the new courthouse building that was under construction at the time. It's located on Houston and Commerce, facing Dealey Plaza.
Approximately what time were you on the 7th floor of that building facing Dealey Plaza?
Sir, I can't recall the exact time, but it was at the time that the parade was coming down towards Dealey Plaza. I did not have a watch at the time.
Were you in a position where you could see the parade?
Yes, sir.
Do you recall seeing anything unusual happening?
Yes, I do.
Would you tell us what happened?
At the time, the parade came down towards going to the school book depository. Dealey Plaza would have been to my left where I was standing. And at the 5th floor of the school book depository, I noticed a man at the 3rd window. This man was dressed. He had on a light hat, and I saw this man later going down Houston Street to the corner of Commerce, and then turn toward town on Commerce. And at that time, before this happened, I heard a single shot which sounded like a small arm, maybe a pistol, and I immediately, there was a slight pause, and immediately after that I heard 3 rifle shots in succession. They seemed to be fired from an automatic rifle, and they came. "We object to the witness giving his conclusions on this," Judge Haggerty would say. "Mr. Carr, do not give your conclusions on this point."
Go ahead and tell us what you heard.
Well, I heard 3 rifle shots fired from a high-powered rifle.
"We object to that unless the man is qualified as an expert. I ask the jury be instructed to disregard that."
Judge Haggerty, it is a question whether or not an ordinary human being, whether he would know a rifle shot or not. I do not know.
Well, we don't know if this man had rifles since he was a child. We don't know that he ever had even been a hunter. And this man, we can We can clarify that very easily. Mr. Carr, have you ever heard rifle fire before?
I have.
Where?
I was a member of the 5th Ranger Battalion in World War II. I qualified as an expert with a bolt-action rifle, which is called a 30-06 in the Army. It is a 30 caliber rifle. Since that time, I used the .225 Winchester. I hunted with a 70 millimeter Remington. I have also loaded my own ammunition, which I do until this day.
Were you ever wounded in action?
Yes.
How many times?
I object to that. Irrelevant. As the judge, I agree that is irrelevant. Why don't you tender Mr. Carr over to the defense as an expert, at least in the field that he knows a rifle shot when he hears it?
One other question.
Have you ever heard rifle fire in combat? Yes, I have heard rifle fire in combat.
On how many occasions?
I landed in Casablanca. I went through North Africa. I was in 2 major offensives in Africa, and from there I went to Anzio Beachhead, and my battalion was annihilated. 13 men left in the 5th Ranger Battalion.
How many of these places did you hear rifle fire?
In all of them, I heard rifle fire, sir.
We tender the witness.
Mr. Carr, when you were qualified in the Army as an expert with a rifle, was that pertaining to marksmanship or the identification of the type of rifle being fired from the noise made? Sir, clarify that. Your qualification as an expert rifleman in the Army, was that in marksmanship and the breaking down of rifles, or the identification of rifle sounds? I became an expert on the range in the act of firing a rifle. In other words, that would be marksmanship, would it not, sir? Yes. Now, these various actions in which your battalion took place, do you know what type of rifles were being fired at you? No, sir, I do not. Do you know whether there was more than one type of rifle being fired at me? Yes, I do know there was more than one type of rifle being fired at me. But you can't name the different types, is that correct? Well, I did not see them, and without seeing, I could not name them. That's all. This is Judge Haggerty. Is the matter submitted?
Yes. The state would add that Mr. Carr is about as expert in the sound of gunfire as you can be and still be walking around.
If the court please, this gentleman may have been fired at many times, but he does not know what type of rifles were being fired. He was never called upon to distinguish as between sounds of various different rifles, and if you hold this man out as an expert, every man, including myself, who was in combat during World War II, would be an expert. I certainly don't hold myself out as one. This is Judge Haggerty. I rule that Mr. Carr is qualified as an expert and can give his opinion on whether a shot or a noise he heard is from a rifle or not, but not what type of rifle. To which ruling counsel objects and reserves a bill of exception, making all the testimony up until this point the defense objection, the court's ruling, and the entire record parts of this bill.
The judge has ruled that you can tell us whether or not the noise you heard was from a rifle, but not what type of rifle.
No, sir. I would not say what type of a rifle. I would not say it was a 30-06.
Objection! There was no question asked. Let's go back to where we were, and can you tell us what you heard?
Yes. A pipe fitter and myself were standing on the 7th floor of on the outside of the structure of this courthouse. We were looking, as I told before in my statement, the FBI and everyone else.
I object to his previous statements to the FBI, Your Honor.
This is Haggerty. Answer the question.
You can go on and tell us what you observed. Tell us what you observed and what you heard.
All right. As I stated before, I noticed this fellow in the window, and this gentleman, the pipe fitter, and myself. He made the statement, too.
I object to what the man made a statement concerning. You can say what you said.
I thought he was a Secret Service agent man or an FBI man.
What did the man in the window look like?
He had on a hat, a felt hat, a light hat. He had on heavy-rimmed glasses, dark. The glasses were heavy-rimmed and heavy earpieces on his glasses.
Go ahead.
He had on a tie. He had on a light shirt, a tan sport coat.
Now, you say you heard gunfire? Will you tell us again what you heard?
Yes, sir. The first I heard, I made the statement before the objection. I say it was small arms, a pistol. He has not been qualified. This is Judge Haggerty. Just say what kind of noise you heard.
What kind of noise did you hear?
I heard a shot. There was a pause, and immediately after that there were 3 shots in succession.
Were you able to tell from where the first shot was coming?
No, sir, not the first one. I could not tell the direction it came from.
Were you able to tell from where the 3 shots came from, which followed?
Yes, I was.
Where did they come from?
They came from where I was standing at the new courthouse. They came from in this direction here, behind this picket fence, and one knocked a bunch of grass up along in this area. This area here is flat. Looking at it from here, but the actual way it is, it's on a slope up this way, and you can tell from the way it knocked it up that the bullet came from this direction. I'll make an indication here on the map.
Now, when you just touched the ruler to this mock-up, what was the area which you were describing as the source of the 3 shots? Can you describe it a little more precisely?
Yes, there was a picket fence along in this area here. It does not show it in here, and it seems the shots came from this direction. And underneath that slope, there were people.
And what happened?
The shots came from this direction, from behind this picket fence that I do not see here, and there is a slope here. There is a grassy slope down here, and there was a lot of people, spectators down here below on this grassy slope. But when those shots were fired, the motorcycle policemen, the Secret Service, and what have you, all came in this direction, the way the shots came from. Some of the people that were sitting there or standing fell to the ground as if the shots were coming off of those.
I object to his conclusions, Your Honor.
It is not a conclusion, Your Honor. I saw it.
I ask the witness be instructed to wait for the court's ruling.
This is Judge Haggerty. I overrule the objection.
To which ruling counsel objects and reserves a bill of exception on the conclusions of this witness. I will make the defense objection, all the questions propounded to this witness, the entire record, and the court's ruling, parts of the bill. Now, of those shots, which of the 3 shots did you hear coming from that area you have just pointed out by the picket fence on the knoll?
The 3 shots, the last 3 shots came from this area.
Did the 3 shots seem break apart in time or very close in time?
No, sir. They were fired from a semi-automatic or either.
I object to this.
This is Judge Haggerty. Just tell us the sequence, Mr. Carr.
You can tell us whether they sounded close or separate.
Yes, they were very close together.
If you were to say with your voice, boom, 3 times, could you give us the approximate separation as you recall it?
Well, boom, 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 just in that order.
All right. Now, I'm not going into the whole thing there, but just so we can see where the spot was on the photo map now, S34. Mr. Carr, that you are looking at now, an aerial photograph of the scene?
Yes.
Could you orient yourself? Can you identify everything by looking at the area photograph?
Yes.
Can you show us the area from which you heard the 3 shots coming on the area photograph?
The 3 shots came from in this direction, right here. I'll indicate it on the map.
Can you recognize the cement arcade in the area photograph?
Yes.
Now, are you able to recall from which ends of the cement arcade the 3 shots came from? Was it from the end towards the depository or the end towards the overpass?
At the end, towards the overpass, right here.
Let the record show that Mr. Carr just indicated. Would you point your ruler up there? Let the record show Mr. Carr is indicating an area on the grassy knoll in the vicinity of the picket fence.
This is Judge Haggerty. Let it be noted on the record.
Now, after the shots, did you notice any movement of any kind?
Yes, I did.
As unusual? That was unusual?
Yes, I did.
Would you tell us what you observed?
Should I point it out, sir?
Yes.
At this point, right here, at this school book depository, there was a Rambler station wagon, there with a rack on the back, built on the top of this.
Which way was the station wagon facing?
It was parked on the wrong side of the street, next to the school book depository, heading north.
North being the top of the photo map. North is the top, as you have indicated.
North is the top, and it was headed in this direction towards the railroad tracks, and immediately after the shooting, there was 3 men that emerged from behind the school book depository. There was a Latin. I can't say whether he was Spanish, Cuban, but he was real dark complected, stepped out and opened the door. There was 2 men entered that station wagon, and the Latin drove it north on Houston. The car was in motion before the rear door was closed. And this one man got in the front, and then he slid in from the driver's side over, and the Latin got back, and they proceeded north, and it was moving before the rear door was closed. And the other man that I described to you, being in this window, which would have been 1, 2, the third window over here, came across the street. He came down, coming towards the construction site on Houston Street to Commerce in a very big hurry. He came to Commerce Street, and he turned toward town on Commerce Street, and every once in a while he would look over his shoulder as if he were being followed.
Now, Mr. Carr, did you have an occasion to give this information to any law enforcement agencies?
Yes, I did.
Did anyone tell you not to say anything about this?
Yes. I object to what anyone told him, Your Honor, on the grounds it's hearsay. This is Judge Haggerty. A moment ago, you asked Mrs. Parker if anybody threatened her. Is it your question, Mr. Garrison, whether or not Mr. Carr was threatened by someone? Is your question to the witness a question of whether or not anyone threatened Mr. Carr?
I will rephrase it. Did anyone threaten you?
At this time, we object to the courts suggesting questions to counsel for the state. The suggested question is completely different from the question previously propounded by the state. This is not the function of a trial judge in any trial.
May it please the court, I will phrase my own questions on this. Mr. Carr, did you talk to any FBI agents about this incident?
Yes, I did.
Did they tell you to forget about it?
I object to that. It's hearsay.
Were you threatened in any way?
This is Judge Haggerty. I sustain the objection. You cannot tell us the words used by someone who spoke to you because of hearsay. However, you can state that you had conversations with them, and what did you do as a result of the conversation? I will permit that.
As the result of the conversations with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, what did you do?
I done as I was instructed. I shut my mouth.
Were you called to testify before the Warren Commission?
No, sir.
I tender the witness.
When did you first notice that President Kennedy had been shot? About an hour and 15 minutes after it happened, sir. Is it your testimony that you did not realize that anything had gone wrong in the presidential motorcade? I realized something had gone wrong, but I did not know what. Did you realize that anyone had been shot? No, sir, I did not. Until an hour and 15 minutes after it happened. Is that your testimony? Yes. I see. Now, wasn't it your testimony that you heard what you thought were gunshots? Yes. Noises? Yes. I did not think it was gunshots. I knew it was gunshots. I see. Didn't you also testify that you saw people running up to the grassy knoll area? I did. Did you draw any conclusions from that? Your Honor, you asked me not to have any conclusions a while ago, did you not? This is Judge Haggerty. You can answer this question. I have conclusions. Yes, I did. Did you conclude that anybody had been shot? I concluded someone had been shot or shot at. Yes. Did you detect any commotion or unusual activities in the vicinity of the presidential vehicle? I detected the vehicle's gathering speed and moving on. Yes, I did. Did you attach any importance to that or think it was unusual? I thought it was very unusual, yes. Now, when did you see the presidential vehicle gathering speed in relation to the gunshots? It was shortly after. Would I be fair in saying it was immediately after the gunshots? I would say there was a pause, and it looked like somebody trying to get home from where I was at. By clapping your hands, first indicating the last gunshot, and then the time that you saw the unusual activity around the president's vehicle, clapping them again so as to show us the space of time. Would you please do that, sir? That has been 5 years ago, and it seemed like minutes, which it was only seconds. In other words, it's your testimony now that it was only seconds between the last shot and you're seeing commotion and unusual activity around the presidential vehicle. Is that correct? Well, now, I ain't said nothing about seeing commotion around the presidential vehicle. What type of commotion I noticed mostly was people running to the area that I described. This area right here, sir. That happened right after the shots were fired. Yes, that happened immediately. Would you say that happened before or after you saw the presidential vehicle accelerate and start to go faster? That happened before. All right, after seeing the people run up the grassy knoll, which happened right after you heard the shots. Right after that, you saw... This is Mr. Alcock. This is not what he said. This is not his testimony. Right after that, you saw the presidential vehicle accelerate. Is that correct? Yes. All right. Now, when you saw the presidential vehicle accelerate, did that attract your attention? No, sir. Not so much as I turned and looked back. As I told you before, I saw these people come out from behind the school book depository, and I am going to try to make this clear to you so where you can understand it. From where I was at, I could not tell whether they came out this side entrance here. There is a side entrance to the school book depository, or whether they came from behind it. But they came either from the side entrance or they came from behind it and got into this station wagon. Now, how about the rest of the motorcade? Did it accelerate along with the presidential? The crowd crowded in so fast until I could not tell anything about the rest of the motorcade or nothing else. There was a lot of commotion there from then on. Was there a great deal of traffic on Stemmons Freeway at the time? Stemmons Freeway is on up here. I'm talking about Elm Street going. You said Stemmons Freeway. Elm Street is here, sir. No, sir. There was not much traffic on Elm Street. Not much traffic? Elm Street had been blocked off for the motorcade. About how many automobiles were in the motorcade? I don't know. Would you say plenty or just one or two? Well, at the time this happened, I saw 3. You only saw 3 vehicles, 3 automobiles in the presidential motorcade? Is that correct? At the time it happened, I had only seen 3. Part of them were on back. Had not gotten to that point yet. Did you ever see any more than these 3? Sir, I saw no more because I explained to you that the commotion was so great that everybody stopped there. There were a lot of people on the streets on both sides. There were people up here, spectators. There were people lined everywhere along that route, all over there. Mr. Carr, weren't you interested in looking at this commotion and trying to see what was causing it? Was I interested in knowing what was causing it? That is correct. I would like to have known, but I could not have gotten through the crowd to find out if I had to. You had a pretty good spot from which to look, didn't you? Yes. Were you looking to try to see what caused it? To see what caused the commotion, you're asking? That's right. No, sir, not to see what caused it. I was looking to see what was going on. You were looking where? You were looking where to see what was going on? I was looking to see why all of the commotion down here and why these people were running. And at the time, you were looking up towards the Texas School Book Depository, seeing 3 men come out from behind it. Is that right? Do you see these dots on this? Would you answer my question and then explain, please, sir? I say, would you answer the question and then explain? Yes, I will answer your question. Repeat it, please. This is Judge Haggerty. Mr. Carr, when a question is put to you, you can answer it yes or no. But you have a right to explain your answer, so you cannot be cut off. So if you wish to explain the answer, you are permitted by law to do so. Yes, that's right. And also, at the same time, you were watching the man whom you say you had seen on the 5th floor of the book depository walk on Houston Street towards Main. Is that right? Yes, and I have, may I explain that? Yes. This is Judge Haggerty. You may explain. The same man that I saw here in this window was with the 3 men that I told you a minute ago. They came out from behind the school book depository, got in the station wagon. 1 man crossed the street and then came down this side of Houston Street and turned onto Commerce Street. And you were watching that procedure at the same time that you were watching what was going on in the grassy knoll area? No, sir. And what was going on around the presidential motorcade and in the motorcade riot? No, sir. I was watching that man at that time, and I watched him until I could see him no longer. But that man acted as if he was in a hurry and someone was following him, and I would know that man if I ever saw him again. And right before the 3 successive shots, you saw a bullet hit in the middle of Dealey Plaza. Is that correct? Repeat that, please. Right before hearing the 3 successive shots, you saw a bullet hit in the middle of Dealey Plaza, right? No, sir. Upon hearing the 3 successive shots, sir, I saw one of those 3 hit in Dealey Plaza in the grass. I see. Did you ever go and look for the hole where it hit? No, sir, I have not. Did you ever try to recover the pellet? No, sir, I have not. Now, is it your testimony that that is, the group of these 3 shots were equally spaced? That is, the space of time between the first and the second was just about the same as that between the second and the third. The 3 shots were consecutively. I take it, then, that you would deny that there was 1 shot and then a relatively long period and then 2 fast shots. Is that correct? Yes, I sure would. I take it. Go ahead, sir. I am sorry, sir. Go ahead. I said I heard 1 shot. There was a pause, and then I heard 3 consecutive shots. I take it, then, that you would also deny that of those 3 consecutive shots, there were 2 rapid ones, and then a relatively long period, and then a third one. Is that right? Yes, I would. That's all, sir. I tendered the witness back to Mr. Garrison.
Just one more question, Mr. Carr. Would you take your time, in your own words, describe with reference to the photo map the direction of that shot, which you observed furrowing on through the grass? From what area to what area could you describe that? From what point to what point?
The shot was fired from somewhere in here.
Just a minute, sir. This is going to be written down. What do you mean by in here? From somewhere to where?
From this direction, in here, that shot was fired.
You are indicating, to begin with, the grassy knoll area by the picket fence. Is that right?
Yes, sir. This is the first thing that attracted my attention, as I explained to you before.
But the direction would have been from there to where?
To in this vicinity right here.
Well, if you carry the line down, would you identify some building or something on the map so that we will know precisely what you mean?
Yes, I will say the criminal courts building right here.
If the shot would have continued, you mean to say?
I object to leading the witness, Your Honor.
I will rephrase the question. If the shot had continued...
If the shot had not hit the grass, it would have hit the criminal courts building, sir.
That's all I have. I tender the witness back to Mr. Diamond for further cross-examination.
Just a couple of questions, Mr. Carr. Is it your testimony that you saw this bullet furrowing through the grass? I saw the grass come up.
You saw the grass come up?
Yes.
And from that, you are telling us from what direction the shot came and where it would have gone if it would have kept on going? Is that right?
Yes.
That's all.
This is Judge Haggerty. Is Mr. Carr released from the obligations of his subpoena? This is Mr. Alcock. Yes, Your Honor. You are excused as a witness. Thank you, Judge. Let's everybody have a seat. Sheriff, now you see it's about 1 minute to 12. We're going to recess for lunch. Let's everybody have a seat. Gentlemen of the jury, as I have said so many times, I must admonish you and instruct you not to discuss the case with one another or anyone else. It is very, very important that you adhere to my instructions. With those instructions, I will turn you over to the sheriffs, and we will be in recess for lunch. You are released under your same bond, Mr. Shaw.
Do you know what it means to miss New Orleans?
Richard Randolph Carr's story is fantastic. As you might have guessed, his story was severely discounted by the authorities at the time of the initial investigation, and his eyewitness testimony was clearly tampered with. The Warren Commission did not call him as a witness, nor was he mentioned in any of their published evidence. It is purported that an FBI agent told him that if you didn't see Lee Harvey Oswald in the school book depository with a rifle, you didn't see it. Later, several members of the Dallas Police Department raided his house in the middle of the night. They claimed that they were looking for stolen goods, but he was not charged with any offense. Carr also received threatening phone calls telling him to leave Texas. He did. He moved to Montana. Later, he found dynamite taped to his car ignition. Just before he testified in the New Orleans trial of Clay Shaw, a gunman attempted to kill him. Another attempt on his life took place in Atlanta. This time he was stabbed, but he managed to kill one of the two men who attacked him. Richard Randolph Carr died in Norton, West Virginia on August 4th, 1996. In many ways, he should be counted as one more victim of the assassination. His life was changed forever as a result of what he saw and experienced that day. But there is no doubt that he was courageous enough to tell the truth about what he saw, what he observed that day in Dealey Plaza. As a juror, you have to be thankful for that. I know what I believe, and I believe he is telling the truth. And whatever you think of Jim Garrison, Richard Randolph Carr would never have been called to testify in a court of law on this topic were it not for him. Courage comes in many shapes and forms. Thank you for listening to episode 48 of JFK, The Enduring Secret.
Welcome to JFK and the Enduring Secret. I'm your host, Jeff Crudell.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode is episode 49, and it's part of a two-part episode. Episode 49 and episode 50. And just when you thought we were going to put the keys in the ignition and head out of Dealey Plaza, well, yep, I found a couple of other things left in the hotel room. A couple more things to pack before we get on our way. So today we're going to have fun with a couple of interesting topics that everybody should get a chuckle over. The first is the Umbrella Man. Probably more famous than a lot of the other witnesses that you have ever heard about related to this case, but with a rather benign and happy ending. And the second is the discussion about the tramps. Remember those tramps? How could I have forgotten the tramps? Like a sock underneath the bed. There is more lore around those tramps than most JFK topics. And I may be giving it to you early, but I know you want to ask if Howard Hunt was one of those men in the picture. Well, stay tuned, and we will take a look at all of this in a couple of pretty good episodes that should get us on our way and out of the plaza. So without further ado, let's listen to episode 49. Well, let's tell the story about the Umbrella Man first. It's not a complicated one. The Umbrella Man, perhaps, is the object of more speculation than just about any other person who was in Dealey Plaza that day. What was a man doing in the middle of Dealey Plaza at high noon with no rain falling at the moment, carrying an open umbrella? Suspicious, right? Granted, that morning there was some misty rain, but the rain cleared up by the time that the motorcade was coming through Dealey Plaza, and so honestly it was an unusual sighting to see somebody with an open umbrella. And certainly no one would have thought anything of it either way had nothing happened that day. But in the aftermath of such a tragic event, and in the process of applying a very critical eye to every frame that was in every movie made in the plaza that day, and every picture taken in the plaza that day, well, it seemed downright spooky. This umbrella stood out, and it stood out like a sore thumb. What was this person doing with an open umbrella? What is interesting in the aftermath of what happened, and over a fairly long period of time, in fact, it took almost 15 years to figure this one out, is the lack of an explanation when the answer was so innocent. So in the absence of explanations, the imaginations of assassination researchers ran wild, with mildly plausible scenarios in the world of the unknown. At first, it was early speculation by certain researchers, including Josiah Thompson and Richard Sprague. The umbrella got the attention of these two men, among others. The difference was that these two were highly respected in the assassination research community. The principal theory that went along with the umbrella man was that this person may have been acting in some capacity as a communications device or someone who was sending some sort of a signal of some kind to other conspirators. Perhaps to go ahead and fire, or perhaps fire a second round if there were multiple gunmen involved. In any case, a man running around in black with a black umbrella in the middle of this entire scene is almost, by definition, somewhat sinister looking, at least visually for everyone watching the films and the pictures in the aftermath. And anything sinister, as you know, had to, by definition, end up in an Oliver Stone film, and it did. So the Umbrella Man had an interesting juxtaposition within the film JFK, and it showed up in other places too, in terms of popular TV shows. For instance, there was an X-Files episode entitled Musings of a Cigarette-Smoking Man. It even got more bizarre at times. There was one assassination researcher, a conspiracy theorist named Robert B. Cutler, who endorsed the idea that the Umbrella Man may have been used to fire a dart with a paralyzing agent pointed right at Kennedy in order to immobilize his muscles and make him a sitting duck for an assassination. Oh my God. I think it's time for a drink. I think people have lost their minds. And surprisingly enough, Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty gave some support and validity to that theory. Really? This is a man with at least some credibility on these topics. And here he goes and does that? Well, you never know where people's minds go when the imagination takes over. There were so many theories that obviously proliferated like weeds in your backyard. One early one was that the Umbrella Man may have been a symbol of protest regarding the U.S. government's failure to provide an umbrella of air support during the Bay of Pigs invasion. We could go on and on about all of these things, but surprisingly, this one theory came closer to the truth than others. But the reality is that even by the time of the convening of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, there was no definitive answer on who this person was and why in the heck they had an umbrella open in the middle of Dealey Plaza that day on November 22nd. You would probably have to have your head entirely in the sand, no matter who you were, to not know about this fella, the Umbrella Man. So that means that the guy who really was the Umbrella Man must have known all this was going on around him. You have to ask yourself, was he just chuckling, was he scared? Was he concerned about ridicule if he came forward? It is kind of silly, right? And if you really were a bad guy, you definitely weren't coming forward. So if you were a good guy, why would you allow that to perpetuate? All the silliness. There's just all sorts of hypotheticals around this crazy circumstance. In the aftermath of the assassination. There's at least one picture that shows two men sitting together on the sidewalk, and on the right side of one photograph there is this man. He's in a dark jacket. He's just sitting there, and he's the Umbrella Man. What the heck? As you know, the House Select Committee on Assassinations was frankly not very good at identifying a lot of people who are important to talk to. The list of important people that they could never find is a mile long. You know, people who had gone missing in the intervening years between the assassination and the time of the House Select Committee hearings. When the meetings were finally convened, there probably is at least one episode that we should dedicate at some point to figure out why they were so inept at that. They certainly had enough money, and they certainly had better on-the-ground investigators than the Warren Commission. Well, who knows on that one? Maybe we just let that sleeping dog lie. But one fish they did catch, after making a specific plea for this person to come forward, was the Umbrella Man, Louis Stephen Witt. Witt came forward in 1978, and he claimed to be the Umbrella Man, and he actually claimed that he still happened to have the original umbrella that he used in the plaza that day, and that has been the subject of such controversy. Okay, and sit down, because I'm going to tell you his explanation when he sat in front of the House Select Committee on Assassinations. His explanation on why he had an open umbrella that day, and this is why I guess you study history a little bit. He said he brought the umbrella simply to heckle Kennedy. Why, you say? Because JFK's father, Joe Kennedy, and I'm sure you know that Kennedy had been ambassador to Great Britain, his support of Neville Chamberlain, who was soft on Hitler and the Nazis before the war, well, that eventually cost him politically. Any thoughts that Joe Kennedy himself had about holding high office were dashed as a result of that decision. If that wasn't enough punitive damage for the Kennedy family, well, here comes Umbrella Man to pile on for something that happened, well, almost 25 years before. You see, this man waving a black umbrella was essentially recreating Chamberlain's trademark fashion accessory, as Witt said during his testimony. Apparently, an umbrella had been used in cartoons in the 1930s to symbolize such appeasement, and the connection was that Chamberlain often carried an umbrella. As far-fetched as that sounds, it's not the first time a black umbrella had been used in connection with protests against the president. It was actually used at the time of the construction of the Berlin Wall, and apparently it was a group of school children from Germany that sent the White House an umbrella labeled Chamberlain. Witt was pretty witty himself. In fact, when he was testifying in front of the House Select Committee, he had a great quote. He said, "I think if the Guinness Book of World Records had a category for people who are at the wrong place at the wrong time doing the wrong thing, I would be number one in that position without even a close runner-up." Well, Louis Stephen Witt, on this one, I have to agree with you. And there you have it. That's the story of Umbrella Man. No secret agent darts. He was not a member of the CIA, just a protester that was frozen in time for a generation. Maybe someone should have told him that Joe Kennedy was just a short time away from leaving this earth. And he was probably right about Joe Kennedy being soft on the Nazis before the war. A lot of businessmen in this country were. But in the end, Joe Kennedy still gave 3 of his sons, his oldest sons, to the service of this country. Sometimes things have a way of working out. While he wouldn't have known at the moment that it would soon be the loss of 3, even the loss of 1 son, right at that moment, already, was enough to warrant closing the umbrella as the president went by that day. So the lesson here is that the assassination researchers have to avoid the idea that every kooky thing that goes on in life is a conspiracy or an element of a conspiracy. Sometimes it's just a kooky thing. Thank you for listening to episode 49 of JFK, The Enduring Secret.
Welcome to JFK and the Enduring Secret. I'm your host, Jeff Crudell.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode is episode 50, and it's the second part of a two-part series, episode 49 and episode 50. It's the last two episodes as we put the keys in the ignition and head out of Dealey Plaza. We will be in the world of forensics next. Well, yep, as I said in the last episode, I found a couple of other things that I left in the hotel room. A couple more stories to pack in and enjoy before we get on our way. Before we get on to today's episode, I have to do a small wander, a small tribute and shout out to my good friend, Chris Schott. Are any of you campers? Usually it's sort of a love-hate relationship with camping. I grew up going quite often as a younger person. I think I've told the story where my parents used to like to go camping and they had a pop-up camper. People really like camping or they really don't like camping. Some folks try it once and never again. The reason I bring up camping is that when you're out camping, there is always something you don't have with you and you just need to improvise. You may not have quite the right equipment, but you've got to get a job done sometimes. So whatever's in the toolbox or packed in with a tent or with the duffel bag, it's going to have to do. My point here is that sometimes things get identified as a tool in a certain circumstance, even when their original intention was for use as something else. So it is, even with my podcast. As I just mentioned, I have a very good friend back in Milton, Georgia, and his name is Chris Schott. Chris is also a really avid fan of the podcast, and we occasionally exchange texts about the podcast. Well, one day Chris is telling me how much he likes the podcast and can't wait for the next episode to come out. And then tells me one of the reasons why he likes it so much. Well, it turns out that my podcast voice happens to have a pretty unique impact on Chris. It puts him to sleep faster than a hypnotist at a Barnum and Bailey event. Well, there you have it. There's this one thing the podcast is designed to do, and that is to advance the ball a little bit on what everybody knows about the JFK assassination. And then there's this other thing. If you've got insomnia, just listen to my podcast. So one night, Chris told me one of the funniest stories. I think he started about 10 o'clock in the evening after settling in on a Sunday night and getting ready for the week ahead. And he proceeded to put on one of my podcasts and then fell asleep within the first 10 minutes. Basically, he woke up an hour later to see that it was concluded. He tried it again and proceeded to fall asleep again within about 10 minutes. Perhaps maybe woke up in the wee hours again, noticing that again he had missed most of it, rewinding it again and starting over. I think either 3 or 4 times was a charm for him that night. But the important thing, though, is that my podcast is now a preferred provider when it comes to the treatment of insomnia. Who would have guessed? Apparently, I can put you to sleep in less than 10 minutes with this voice. Well, honestly, Chris isn't the only one that has said something like that to me about the podcast. He's the only one, though, that has actually admitted to falling asleep during the middle of these episodes. Somehow, he really must stay at it because I know he listens to every one of them and almost immediately when they come out. Thanks, Chris. Thanks for being a great friend, and thanks for being a great fan of the podcast, too, and thanks for showing us how to use something in our duffel bag to cure an age-old problem. Oh, well, that was a fun wander. Let's turn our attention now to the story of the 3 tramps. These guys are campers of sorts, aren't they? This story has more interesting substance to it, even though, at the end of the day, there is little controversy that these men were not identifiable. Indeed, they were. If there is any continuing controversy around the tramps, it's that the thread still leads back to some dubious circumstances that, to this day, still generate at least some lingering doubts about the truth related to this matter. So here we go. The story of the 3 tramps. Probably the most famous story, and we will address it, whether or not Howard Hunt, the famous CIA operative and Watergate conspirator, was one of these tramps. And of course, the other now famous story is whether or not actor Woody Harrelson's father, Charles Harrelson, was one of those tramps. Harrelson's father was a bad dude, and there is no doubt that his M.O. could have easily put him in the middle of all of this. But there is no credible evidence that truly links Harrelson to this crime. And on at least one occasion, he was interviewed and vehemently denied his involvement. But let's all remember that criminals don't confess their crimes. Well, most of the time anyway. But stranger things have happened during the JFK assassination story. So let's get into some of the details about these tramps. And just remember, this is the very last episode from Dealey Plaza and its witnesses before we move on to the other parts of the story. Now, this time, if I've left a toothbrush or a shoe, then I will be off to the store at the next stop.
Dreams, so they say, are for the fools and they let them drift away. Peace, like the silent dove, should be flying, but it's only just begun. Like Columbus in the olden days, we must gather all our courage, sail our ships out on the open sea, cast away our fears, and all the years will come and go, take us up, always up. We may never pass this way again. We may never pass this way again. We may never pass this way.
The story of the three tramps sounds like a fable. As simple as this one is on the surface, it gets more involved in a hurry. For my friends in North Carolina, think of a mountain lake with lots of spidering waterways and coves. There are a lot of places to go, explore, and then accidentally get lost in. That is the essence of the family tree related to the three tramps. I will start by saying this. It all starts with 7, and only 7, rather pristine photographs. Photographs of 3 men who were rounded up just minutes after President Kennedy was shot. The chain of events was logical, and we know it well by now after hearing the story over and over in so many episodes. Here's what I mean. Immediately after the shots rang out, the crowds followed the trail of the assassins, and there was plenty of reason for the crowds and the police to make their way up the grassy knoll, and from there, head into the railroad yard parking lot and eventually continue searching north toward the railroad tracks. We know that generally, and we have heard pieces of this action during my storytelling in various episodes, and that is what they did, both civilians and authorities. It was logical to think that if someone had fired a shot from somewhere in the railroad yard, say behind the picket fence, that they would have torn off and headed for cover in a hurry around the sea of railroad cars that existed right there behind the parking lot. So obviously, the authorities headed up there, and there were specific instructions to search all the railroad cars in the yard, although there are varying accounts on the thoroughness of that search by the authorities and which railroad boxcars they actually did search. One story has Lee Bowers giving the tip to the police, communicating to them that he saw exactly where these men were hiding. However, such a statement was not included in any of his official Warren Commission testimony, nor in his sheriff's office affidavits, so it's not clear about this idea that Bowers may have directed them. It's really not clear if it has any validity at all. It does have implications, though. If Bowers did see these men move through the rail yard, it raises the question of whether they had greater involvement, and he probably would have seen exactly what that involvement was, watching from his perch in the railroad tower. But clearly he hadn't said anything about it in his official statements and testimony to the Warren Commission. But regardless of how it came about, the Dallas police managed to come across some characters during their search of the railroad yard, And this story is about 3 of them that were found basically hiding in a boxcar. They were immediately taken into custody, and they were marched from where they were in the railroad yard through Dealey Plaza and eventually over to the sheriff's office for administrative processing. As they were escorted by policemen through Dealey Plaza, they easily caught the attention of the swarm of reporters that were already in the plaza in the aftermath of the shooting. So let's start with the testimony of Dallas policeman D.V. Harkness as he spoke to the Warren Commission in 1964. He was interviewed by our now well-known commission lawyer, David Bellin. He would describe it this way to the commission. Well, we got a long freight that was in there, and we pulled some people off of there and took them to the station. Mr. Bellin, you mean some transients? Tramps and hobos that were on the freight car? Yes, sir. Then what did you do? That was all my assignment because they shook 2 long freights down that were leaving, to my knowledge, in all the area there. We had several officers working in that area. Do you know whether or not anyone found any suspicious people of any kind or nature down there in the railroad yard? Yes, sir. We made some arrests. I put some people in. Were these what you call hobos or tramps? Yes, sir. Were all those questioned? Yes, sir. They were taken to the station and questioned. Any guns of any kind found? Not to my knowledge. The tramps were marched to the sheriff's office via a route that led through Dealey. We'll stop there. And as a result of that march through Dealey Plaza came the 7 pristine pictures of the tramps. And guess who got a chance to photograph these 3 men as they were taken across the plaza? Yep, you guessed right. The Dallas Morning News, the Dallas Times-Herald, and actually the third would be a little harder to guess, the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. Each of these 3 newspapers photographed these 3 men as they were marched away under police escort near the Texas School Book Depository shortly after the assassination. Now, at that moment, these men, of course, were not yet known as the 3 tramps, but later you heard Sergeant Harkness in his official testimony slap that moniker on, and it stuck. Well, I am going to wander again for just a second. A few episodes ago, you heard the story of my grandfather on the railroads, so I guess it's fitting that I tell one more generality about another group of men who made their life around the railroads. And exactly how did this come to be? Stop for just a second and imagine a world around 1860 when the country was beginning to race west in America, and the railroads were how we were getting there. And that world stayed in place with a slow assault on the geography of the land to the west of the Mississippi, an assault that took place in a steady order. For it would not be long until the golden spike was placed in the ground and east would meet west. Now, almost naturally, the railroads would be the only real source of longer distance travel that a migrant in that time frame could undertake. The railroads forbid it, of course, but they had no real way of stopping it. And so men who might first be dubbed migrant workers were eventually dubbed hobos, as they would dash on the train, lucky enough sometimes to be above and inside of a boxcar, in a place where they might actually survive the trip. But not always. You see, in those days, many of the men who rode the rails just got low. In other words, they found themselves intertwined in the lower chassis of those boxcars, a chassis that was comprised of metal struts or bars that provided structural support for the wooden boxcars that rested on top of them. It was a convenient place to slip into, and sometimes that put these men in a position of riding dangerously close to the ground, and possibly subject to the perils of riding that way. The ballast on the track, those big stones that are all around a railroad tie and help keep it in place, well, those rocks would kick up and act like a small missile, or items would be left on the tracks. It was a real risk of loss of life or limb. Nothing you or I would have done in our day, but still it was commonplace then. It's easy to understand why this was a widespread practice in 1860, given no other alternative. Now, Fast forward to the Great Depression, and once again, rail riding by a small subculture gained popularity in a period where so many people were going through hard times. Fast forward another 30 years later and wind up in 1963, and there was still remnants of it left on the rails. And a bit of those remnants were present right there in the railroad yard at Dealey Plaza. These kind of places were the last bastion of it in the country. Hobos were real, even in 1963. And that's what makes it so interesting. I'm telling you, you can't make this stuff up. So let's get back to those 7 incredible photos made mostly by high-end cameras and taken by professional photographers working for professional news agencies. Despite the fact that newsmen took them, they did not get the early scrutiny that other assassination matters did in the early period after the Warren Commission findings were released and criticism began to mount. Many of the photos were close-ups with rather clear pictures of the faces of these men, making the idea of accurate identification seem rather routine. But remember, this is the story of the JFK assassination, and here is where fact is stranger than fiction. And in fairness, not all the pictures were clear shots of the face, and not all were that close up. They certainly weren't mugshots. Just enough ambiguity in those pictures to turn the whole thing into a mysterious element of the case. Who were these men? Those photos were a sleeping dog, really, just lying there quietly on the floor, largely unchallenged as a source of controversy in the assassination. Their involvement in the case first heats up through actions taken by Richard Sprague. Sprague was a consultant, and for all my friends and listeners in public accounting, Sprague worked for Touche Ross and ran their computer systems consulting practice. He became an assassination researcher and also, over time, one of the leading experts in the research community on photographic evidence related to the assassination. Sprague is said to have compiled these photographs in 1966 and 1967 and subsequently turned them over to Jim Garrison during Garrison's investigation of Clay Shaw. Between 1966 and 1969, he served as the photographic expert for the JFK investigation conducted by Garrison. Now, what Garrison did next with him is, again, where fact makes for a better storytell than fiction in the JFK assassination story. It was a chain of events, but a volunteer investigator working for Garrison on the case, Mort Saul, made an appearance on The Tonight Show. He made a reference to Garrison and basically looked at the audience and asked them if they wanted to hear directly from Garrison. The crowd response was overwhelming. Well, NBC and The Tonight Show seemed obliged, and it wasn't long afterward that Garrison got a telegram from The Tonight Show. So they had invited him, and he accepted. What happened the day of the taping of that Tonight Show episode is bizarre and really adds to the paranoia of anyone believing that the reach of the government, as well as its general influence, is deep, and certainly the case when it comes to the national media outlets in 1963. I'll digress for just a minute and tell a little bit of the story of that day. Garrison was scheduled to appear before a nationwide audience on the January 31st, 1968 episode of The Tonight Show. But the high drama began several hours before the show's scheduled taping one afternoon. Right as Garrison showed up at the NBC studios, here's what happened. Almost immediately, Garrison was whisked into a room with 3 or 4 well-dressed men who he assumed were NBC lawyers, and the pre-taping grilling began and lasted for several hours. By this time, Carson was apparently unsettled by Garrison's impending appearance, showing up for just a moment during the lawyer's interrogation of Garrison. In and out. I wonder if he promoted the pre-taping review or whether Carson, as part of the NBC corporate bureaucracy, had to simply accept the heavy-handed approach that the network decided to serve up that day for Garrison. Once they took the stage for taping, more events began to unfold. It starts out how you might have guessed based on the pre-taping events. Carson stiffly interrogates Garrison using a list of questions that were undoubtedly prepared by NBC lawyers and undoubtedly designed to discredit Garrison in the investigation. Garrison wouldn't play along, and decided to evade the discussion of Carson's scripted questions. And finally, out of frustration, Carson asked him why the government would still be concealing evidence. Garrison believes he has to seize the moment, looking at Johnny and saying, "Don't ask me, ask Lyndon Johnson. You know he has to have the answer." And he opens his briefcase, pulling out pictures of these three men, the so-called tramps, holding them in the air for the cameras to focus on. Stunned, Carson immediately moves to prevent Garrison from showing the pictures, and as Garrison later described it, Carson lunged at his arm like a cobra, pulling it down violently so that the pictures were out of the camera's view. Carson lashed out. "Pictures like this don't show up on television." Despite that, Garrison kept going, answering, "Sure they do. The camera can pick this up." Carson kept at it again, yanking down Garrison's arm that was holding the pictures, and again said sharply, "No, they can't." For a third and final time, Garrison would try and hold up the pictures, and the light on the broadcast camera would go red. The producer had stopped filming. Still undeterred, and before Carson could react anymore, Garrison in his booming voice would say, "Those arrested men you just saw were never seen again. They all got away." No doubt Carson and NBC were spooked by Garrison's appearance. Were they worried that they might be sued and be held liable somehow if Garrison wrongly accused these men of murdering the president? Was it more sinister than that? Had someone high up in government gotten to the NBC executives and deliberately tried to quash his appearance or turn the show into a way to embarrass him, versus letting him have an objective moment on national television to tell the American public what he believed? Was the whole topic just too controversial to do anything but stay on script and stay away from anything that could bring a backlash to the Tonight Show? In a more far-out theory involving the military-industrial complex, was NBC's corporate parent, RCA, pressured and then put pressure on NBC? RCA was fairly involved in the production of various military equipment at the time. Whatever it was, they were dead set against Garrison having a forum to present anything objective on the Carson Show. And certainly anything controversial about the assassination was not going to be presented on the Carson Show. In terms of reasons, it was probably a mix of all of the above, and then some. For anyone who ever watched The Tonight Show, Johnny Carson was, for the most part, a conformist. Now, don't get me wrong, I love that show. I grew up with that show. But this was not a man that was going to wade into these kind of waters. No. Carson had too much to lose and not enough to gain on this one. All right, I'm done with that little wander. But the point is that on the night of January 31st, 1968, the Tramps became national figures known to just about everybody. Man, you may not have paid too much attention to Who Shot JFK, but who missed an episode of The Tonight Show? Hardly anybody. Well, at least hardly anybody I knew. Oh, and if you are doing the math, I was 7 then. Probably in bed well before 11 in those days. But Johnny was on for a long, long time. And I watched him for a long, long time. When I was old enough to do so. Mostly with my dad before we all headed to bed. Those were great memories with my dad for sure. Thanks, Johnny. Let's fast forward to 1974, when 2 assassination researchers make it onto the scene. It's Alan J. Weberman and Michael Canfield. And these 2 gentlemen began comparing photographs of these 3 men to people they believed to be suspects involved in a conspiracy. Now, please do take note of the year, 1974. There was a lot going on in 1974. Watergate had occurred, Nixon had resigned over Watergate, and the Watergate burglars were now pretty famous dudes, particularly because a number of them were CIA guys. Their pictures were all over the papers. Well, Weberman and Canfield must have picked up the Washington Post and or the New York Times, and after getting a hold of the right publications, wound up just staring at those 7 pristine photographs and a bunch of pictures of these now famous Watergate burglars, and I just bet that, for them, the light bulb went on without much effort. These two researchers concluded that 2 of the 3 tramps in the photos were Watergate burglars E. Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis. Oh my gosh! We're off to the races again. This time it's not the Tonight Show, but man, it's way more explosive. Well, comedian and civil rights activist Dick Gregory, remember back to a previous episode when we discussed his involvement with Robert Grodin and the Zapruder film showing? Well, Gregory helped bring national media attention to the allegations against Hunt and Sturgis in 1975. He did it after obtaining the comparison photographs from Weberman and Canfield. Immediately after obtaining those photographs, Gregory held a press conference and received considerable coverage, and his charges were reported in Rolling Stone and Newsweek. Frank Sturgis and Dan Carswell, a CIA agent, was allegedly arrested in Dealey Plaza, disguised as a tramp, hiding in a railroad car behind the grassy knoll, from where witnesses claimed to have heard gunshots. Well, all of this was sensational news at its highest, right? Someone needs to investigate. So here comes the Rockefeller Commission, and they reported in 1975 that indeed they had investigated the allegation that Hunt and Sturgis, on behalf of the Central Intelligence Agency, participated in the assassination of Kennedy. The final report of that commission stated that witnesses who testified that the derelicts, as they were then called in the commission's official report, did bear a resemblance to Hunt or Sturgis, but those folks making such allegations were not shown to have any qualification in photo identification beyond that possessed by an average layman. That was a polite way to say, I don't want to believe what I am hearing, and therefore you are not qualified to say it, or something like that. Their report also stated that FBI agent Lyndall L. Schoenfeld, remember him from our previous episodes regarding the Zapruder film? Well, they labeled Schoenfeld a nationally recognized expert in photo identification and photo analysis. And of course, he was with the FBI Photographic Laboratory. Schoenfeld had concluded from photo comparisons that none of the men were Hunt or Sturgis. Somehow, I just have a sneaking suspicion on this one. When the Rockefeller Commission relies on the FBI to make this particular call? Well, the bottom line is that the Rockefeller Commission tried to dispel the theory that Hunt and Sturgis were involved, for all the obvious reasons. Plus, let's face it, it wasn't necessarily compelling photographic matches for sure. Either way. Now, we let this issue age for 5 more years, and even more sinister theories begin to pile up around the identity of these tramps and their involvement somehow in the assassination. So in 1979, the House Select Committee on Assassinations became very interested in resolving the topic of who these men were because, after all, identifying who they were to begin with was key to determining whether this was a couple of innocent hobos riding the rails or whether these were men that were involved in something much more sinister. And remember, the Assassinations Committee initially, at least, had high hopes that more sophisticated analysis of the photographic evidence in the case would yield the answers that just weren't there in 1964. We know now that that did not turn out to be the case, but it certainly was a lofty goal, and they were determined to apply it with regard to the 3 tramps as well. So the House Select Committee on Assassinations reported that they had forensic anthropologists deployed on the project, as well as other photographic experts, and had again analyzed and compared the photographs of the tramps with those of Hunt and Sturgis, as well as with photographs of some new characters that researchers had begun to identify as possible matches for the men in the pictures. The committee looked at photographs of Thomas Valley, Daniel Carswell, and Fred Lee Chrisman. According to the committee, only Chrisman resembled any of the tramps, but the same committee determined that he was not in Dealey Plaza on the day of the assassination. Regarding Sturgis, there were other theories about him, We'll get to him in a separate, more comprehensive episode when we get to the telling of the story of Oswald and his involvement with the CIA/Cubans. Sturgis and Hunt both played central roles in the CIA's involvement in Cuba, including the Bay of Pigs matter, which is what makes this part so intriguing to most researchers. So, at this moment, a lot of people thought that the Select Committee's conclusions that Sturgis and Hunt were not involved, and that only Chrisman was not a definite rule-out, well, that it would have put to bed the allegations around who these three men were. But here is the thing. Ruling out somebody is way different than positively identifying who these guys were, and nobody had done that yet. Well, not yet, but hold on. Lots more is coming on this story, but let me stop for a minute. There are a few details that need to be told. Details that were the part of the incendiary beginnings of why this felt so suspicious to folks once they began to zero in on the tramps. First, the pictures of these three men show a casual walk through Dealey Plaza, with a very casual set of Dallas police leading and following with shotguns in hand. The picture depicts anything but a serious and time-sensitive roundup of these men as possible suspects in the crime of the century. Oh, and yes, they were charged immediately under a category of detainment known as investigative arrest. And while these men were arrested by the Dallas police, they were sort of walked over to the sheriff's office for further booking. Highly unusual for that to happen. This process would almost never have occurred if a suspect had been picked up initially by the Dallas police. Under normal circumstances, they would have gone to the police station and not to the sheriff's office, even on that day. That is how it worked. So why? Why did that happen? But one thing is for sure. They were arrested. Only guess what? When folks went looking for the arrest records in the 1960s and even into the 1970s and through most of the 1980s and almost into the 1990s, these arrest records, well, they were nowhere to be found. Missing in action. MIA. Oh, and it wasn't just the arrest record itself that was missing. It was also their mugshots and their fingerprints. It was as if they were entirely erased from the record. I'll get back to the arrest records in just a minute. Next, there were over a dozen men in total arrested that afternoon in and around Dealey Plaza, including the tramps. And they were all basically investigative arrests. People who were doing something suspicious or acting suspicious enough that the police decided to temporarily detain them in the aftermath of the shooting. Not surprising, right? But to release them after virtually no interrogation and no ability to recall them if circumstances subsequently developed that required their presence. I mean, this was the murder of the President of the United States. Of course, the biggest point of quandary that the conspiracy theorists picked up on was that all of these men appeared to be clean-shaven and well-dressed and with haircuts. And so that just didn't fit the MO of a hobo hopping on a train and riding the rails. This fact alone would really fuel the conspiracy theorists, especially in the absence of positive identification of just who in the heck these three men really were. And there were some folks that looked at them and came to a different conclusion about how well coiffed they actually were. Our esteemed Professor McAdams was one of them, and he and his followers described the third tramp as having been fired from a cannon through a Salvation Army thrift shop. Now, that's funny right there. I don't care what you say. As a side note, my dad used to say that. When he saw something funny, and he would laugh even heartier and draw into his trademark grin right afterward. That image stays with me today, and it makes me laugh now. Even though the House Select Committee felt like they had done much to put the rumors to bed, namely by further confirming the ruling out of Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis through their forensic anthropology efforts, still the absence of a positive identification of these men over an extended period of years was like jet fuel to the conspiracy cause. Now the story just keeps getting juicier. Oh, and those two pictures do look like Hunt and Sturgis. I don't care what you say. So the truth is that there was enough of an actual resemblance to the two men that conspiracy theorists were keeping the talk alive about it being those two guys. Even after the House Select Committee had formally concluded that the pictures of the three did not represent pictures of Hunt or Sturgis or even Valley or Carswell. Okay, fast forward about 3 years to September 1982. Remember Woody Harrelson? Now an incredibly popular actor, and for those of us old enough to remember, you might remember him for his time on the immensely popular show Cheers, or maybe more recently in some very good and very scary movies. Well, guess what? His dad was a rather bad man. Many would say his dad was a contract killer, plain and simple. His name was Charles Harrelson. The story of Charles Harrelson is fascinating in and of itself, but I'll have to get to that later. If you want to know more about this incredibly interesting and doubly unsavory character, listen to a relatively new Spotify podcast, Son of a Hitman. It's very good, and it will enlighten you on this character. Well, in 1982, Charles was wanted for the murder of a federal judge, John H. Wood, Jr. Charles Harrelson confessed to killing Wood, and in the same incident, he confessed to being involved in the shooting of President Kennedy, and he did this during a 6-hour standoff with police, in which he was reportedly high on cocaine. Joseph Chagra, the brother of Jamil Chagra, testified during Harrelson's trial that Harrelson claimed to have shot Kennedy, and Harrelson even drew maps to show where he was hiding during the assassination. Not too many people believed the claim at the time, and certainly the FBI gave it no credence. But then again, what would you expect from them on this one? According to Jim Marrs' 1989 book Crossfire, Harrelson is believed to be the youngest and tallest of the tramps by many assassination researchers. Marrs stated that Harrelson was involved with criminals connected to intelligence agencies and the military, and even went so far as to suggest that he was connected to Jack Ruby through Russell Douglas Matthews, a third party with links to organized crime who was known to both Harrelson and Ruby. Boy, this starts to get interesting, doesn't it? Now we have people claiming to have been involved in the killing of the president. As I said, you can't make this stuff up. Still, at this point, no positive identification of these three tramps, so the speculation and guessing game as to who they really are continues to proliferate within the conspiracy side of the assassination research community. Oh, and where are those police records? Still missing after all these years? Will they ever be found? Well, guess what? The next big break came when the Dallas City Council voted to release in 1989 all city records having to do with the assassination. Several years later, in about 1992 or so, journalist Mary LaFontaine, who was looking through those very records and discovered the arrest records for these three men. Arrest records that corresponded with the three tramps. The three men identified were Harold Doyle, John Forrester Gedney, and Gus Abrams. And of course, the $64,000 question was, were these the real deal? Was this the true identification of those tramps? According to the arrest records, the three men were taken off a boxcar in the railroad yards right after President Kennedy was shot, detained as investigative prisoners, described as unemployed and passing through Dallas, then released 4 days later. An immediate search for the three men by the FBI and others was prompted by an article by Ray and Mary LaFontaine that appeared on the front page of the February 9th, 1992 Houston Post. Less than a month later, the FBI reported that Abrams was dead and that interviews with Gedney and Doyle revealed no new information about the assassination. This was a potentially juicy story, and the FBI's assessment that there was no new information was not going to satisfy an investigative reporter, and particularly one from a media outlet that was not necessarily shying away from the controversy of the Kennedy case. And by this time in life, there were more than a few. Ray and Mary LaFontaine, working for the tabloid TV program A Current Affair, set out to find Harold Doyle, whose address was listed on the arrest record as Red Jacket, West Virginia. The trail led from West Virginia to Amarillo, Texas, where the LaFontaines found one of Doyle's former neighbors, who remembered him talking about his arrest in Dallas. Doyle was finally located in Klamath Falls, Oregon. He told his story on camera and was also questioned by the FBI. The FBI and private researchers sought the other two tramps. Gedney was located in Melbourne, Florida, serving as a municipal officer, a respected member of the community who had not spoken about his former life as a vagabond until interviewed by researcher Billy Cox and by the FBI. Both Doyle and Gedney told the same story of spending the night before the assassination at a rescue mission. According to Oliver Revelle of the Dallas FBI office, both men commented that they had gotten fresh clothes, showered, shaved, and had a meal. They headed back to the railroad yard, and when they heard all the commotion and sirens and everything, and then they asked what had happened, they were told the president had been shot. In 1992, Doyle said that he was aware of the allegations and did not come forward for fear of being implicated in the assassination. He added, "I am a plain guy, a simple country boy, and that's the way I want to stay. I wouldn't be a celebrity for $10 million. Gedney independently affirmed Doyle's account, and a researcher who tracked down Abrams' sister confirmed that Abrams lived the life of an itinerant train hopper and had died in 1987. Despite the Dallas Police Department's 1989 identifications of these three tramps as being Doyle, Gedney, and Abrams, and the lack of evidence connecting them to the assassination, some researchers have continued to seek or maintain other identifications for the tramps and to theorize that they may have been connected to the crime. Let's face it, some researchers will forever find it suspicious that the Dallas police had quickly released the tramps from custody, apparently without investigating whether they might have witnessed anything significant related to the assassination, and the fact that the police records of their arrests, as well as their mugshots and fingerprints, had also gone missing. Those police reports and documents went missing for so long, it's hard to erase the suspicions around them. Even today, some interesting facts about the police reports that surfaced and the policemen that were supposedly involved in this little matter is quite interesting. First, all the arrest forms are signed by one policeman, William Earl Chambers. After these records surfaced, Chambers was interviewed with other officers in 1992 by the FBI. That group of officers who were ostensibly involved with the handling of the hobos also included Billy Lee Bass, Roy Vaughn, R.C. Wagner, Marvin Wise, David Harkness, whom you heard from a little bit earlier, and William E. Middleton. Billy Bass was the man that turned the men over to a deputy sheriff when they got to the sheriff's office. In Billy's words, they searched no other boxcars after finding these three men. That is not consistent with the Harkness testimony to the Warren Commission, but Bass may not have been aware of all the goings-on that day. Or maybe he was. Harkness probably did know more, as he was in charge of that matter, the search, that is, at that very moment. R.C. Wagner could not recall being involved in any way in the interview of these three tramps. Isn't that strange? I just can't believe that. It's hard for me to believe a trained police officer involved with interrogating anyone related to the assassination of the president on that day would forget that. William E. Middleton was apparently at home on the day of the assassination and was never involved in the arrests, and yet he is listed on the documents. Again, Marvin Wise was said to have written down the names of 2 of the 3 tramps on a slip of paper that he put away and stored for a year, and then finally got rid of it. But he doesn't remember those names. Well, maybe okay on that one. But why would he have the occasion to write that down outside of a police report? Yeah, I guess just the craziness of that day. Oh, and Roy Vaughn. Poor Roy Vaughn was involved here too. We have not gotten to him yet in the story, but he was the Dallas policeman guarding the garage entrance to the police department on Sunday morning when Oswald was shot. And within a short time after the shooting, he was implicated by one of his fellow officers as perhaps being the reason that Ruby got into the garage so easily that day and was able to shoot Oswald. He had to live with that one for the rest of his life. True or not, and he did vehemently deny it. And finally, none of them remember much of anything about the interrogation of these 3 men. I mean, if they really were just hobos, would you? See, that's the hard part to challenge on this one. If they were just hobos, then some of this really does make sense. Well, they did ask them if they were hobos, and that was pretty much it. Big yawn. Really uneventful. Now, one part of me wants to react differently here. Geez, they were essentially hiding in the boxcars in the railroad yard, for God's sake, right after the shooting of the President of the United States. I really don't care what you say. This is either really shoddy police work or more is involved here. But undoubtedly, more should have been done and more care should have been taken to explore this more in the hours and days after the assassination as the story developed. These men may have seen something. I mean, if they were not part of it, and for sure they were scared, they wanted no part of being tagged as witnesses to the assassination. I get that, but it matters not. If they saw something, they had an obligation to say something and speak the truth about what they saw. Harkness testified to the Warren Commission that there were other men arrested that day. John F. Elrod was one of them, and he was arrested along the railroad tracks. It was about the same time as the arrest of the 3 tramps. There was a dispatch regarding a man carrying a rifle who was walking along the railroad tracks. It's documented in the John F. Elrod arrest record that a dispatch went out indicating that a man carrying a rifle was walking along the railroad tracks. Where did that dispatch come from? This is one of the most intriguing evidentiary elements in today's episode. Sitting right there in the arrest record for Elrod is this incredible diamond in the rough. Who phoned that in? How did that information get to the police? What else did the police know about this sighting that is not sitting in the official written records? I would really like for you as a listener to this podcast to go to the blog at www.podcastjfk.com for this episode, episode 50, and you can see the arrest record for Elrod and what was documented in typewritten form. What we just stated is all right there, taken down on November 22nd, 1963. Really, you can't make this stuff up. Leave a comment if you will. By the way, one more outrageous claim that, in my mind, must be substantially discounted as false, but I'll state the claim. Elrod later claimed that he had spent 4 hours in a cell with Oswald during Oswald's last 48 or so hours there at the jail in captivity. We know that the police kept Oswald in isolated jail cells by himself, so this is highly unlikely, even if nothing more than an exaggeration, as they were likely in the jail at the same time. But what he claimed he heard is actually the more outrageous piece of the story. He claimed that, in that time frame, Oswald disclosed that he knew Jack Ruby. Not a very credible witness, but certainly an incredible claim. I know. Why would Oswald reveal that to a stranger at that moment, before he was murdered by Ruby a very short time later? Sounds like a story made up after the fact by Elrod. Well, that is my story, and I'm sticking to it. This time I am in agreement with the FBI. Okay, let's wander back and finish up with the 3 tramps. you would think that would have done it, right? That now there were 3 positively identified individuals. So that is the end of it. Well, it never works that way, at least not in this case. The speculation just continued. First, people were quite suspicious that it took over 25 years to come up with these missing investigative arrest records. Could it be that they were fabricated? It was an easy excuse to ignore what had been found and continue the speculation about who these men really were. After all, maybe these newly found records were fabricated. But 2 of the 3 witnesses had been tracked down, and the sister of the third, Gus Abrams, who was now deceased, had also been tracked down. And they all made statements supporting the claim that these 3 men were indeed the 3 hobos that day in the plaza. And there was much more investigative reporting that I forgot to touch upon earlier, that I'll make a quick wander on now, because it goes to the idea that the news media, and not just the authorities, also got a chance to run down this story and get what at least one of the tramps had to say firsthand, for you as a juror to hear. So stay tuned on that one. In my mind, there are many lingering suspicions, and one of the biggest of them is pretty simple. If these men were arrested in connection with the investigation of President Kennedy's murder, why is there no interrogation record? I just can't believe that if these arrests were done properly, that all of them would not have been placed in a room and heavily interrogated about what happened and how they might have been involved. An interrogation that was certain to happen if this process was on the up and up, and then documented, and especially if they stayed 4 days, as the arrest records say. But we also know that there are some accounts that they were released within minutes of getting to the sheriff's department. Chauncey Holt, who I will say more about in a minute, chronicles this in some of his own writings. In other accounts, they stayed only perhaps 2 days in some cases. But in any case, they did not stay the full 4 days as documented in the investigative arrest records. If so, then what does that mean? There are other goofy stories too. In September 1991, a new character arrives on the scene. His name is Charles Rogers. How did he come into the picture? Well, 2 private investigators, John Craig and Philip Rogers, who were working on a book about an unsolved murder case, claim that Charles Rogers, who disappeared in 1965 after the dismembered bodies of his parents were found in a refrigerator, was, yes, a CIA operative who was identified by his friends and relatives as one of the tramps. This far-out story was soon squelched. According to the Houston Chronicle, a homicide detective who worked on the original murder case of Rogers' parents described the scenario as far-fetched. But wait, we are still not done yet. 3 months later, in a 1991 Newsweek article about Oliver Stone's JFK, a man named Chauncey Holt received national attention for various claims he made regarding the assassination of President Kennedy, including that he was one of the 3 CIA operatives photographed as the tramps. Holt also stated that he was with Harrelson in Dealey Plaza on the day of the assassination. According to Holt, he was ordered to Dallas to deliver phony Secret Service credentials. Wow, doesn't that sound plausible given all the facts we know about phony Secret Service agents in the plaza that day? But Holt claims that he was not involved in killing Kennedy, nor did he have knowledge of who did. John Craig and Philip Rogers' 1992 book, The Man on the Grassy Knoll, eventually connected Charles Harrelson, Charles Rogers, and Chauncey Holt by alleging that they were the 3 tramps photographed in Dealey Plaza. According to that book, Harrelson and Rogers were sharpshooters on the Grassy Knoll and were assisted by Holt. It's like a Chinese menu. Every book's got a different combination. Oh, I know, it's starting to get a little far-fetched. But honestly, don't be so skeptical yet. I think Chauncey Holt deserves more study and might possibly be real. Let's consider meeting him again when we talk about the CIA. I'll wait to see if any of you are listening and say something about it on the blog. And then I have more for you on Chauncey Holt when we get to episodes around possible CIA elements that may be somehow involved in the Kennedy assassination. So let's sum it up one more time. Despite the Dallas Police Department's 1999 identifications of the three tramps as being Doyle, Gedney, and Abrams, some researchers have continued to maintain other identifications for the tramps and to theorize that they may have been connected to the crime. All I am going to say as we near the end of this episode is that let's revisit this again when we get to the part of the podcast that deals with CIA operatives that could have been involved in some way. That is all I'm going to say for now on this topic. Wow. What a thing to leave behind in the hotel room. Like a good shoe, I think. Aren't you glad that I decided to turn around and go back and pick it up? I think this story was worth going back for. Not sure if I could have duplicated this where I am driving to next, and once again, I'm hungry now, so let's stop here and go have a sandwich. See you next in episode 51 as we pivot to the world of criminal forensics and their contribution to the enduring secret.
We had nothing to do with it, and I'm telling you the God's and honest truth. We had nothing to do with it. Like I say, we was booked and went in front of the jury and got 6 days for vagrancy and turned loose. We went over to the railroad yard. We was going to Fort Worth. And I seen a guy in a rail. Before we went to the railroad yard, sirens and everything was going on. But like I said, I had nothing to do with it. It don't bother me whether they believe me or not. If they want to think I did it, that's up to the individual. Because we never had nothing to do with it. Maybe some people's in it were dead now. Done passed away. Maybe that's why they opening them up now, a little at a time. Maybe somebody was involved has done passed away. But like I say, the tramps had nothing to do with it.
Thank you for listening to episode 50 of JFK, The Enduring Secret.
Welcome to JFK and the Enduring Secret. I'm your host, Jeff Crudell.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode is episode 51.
Then at 1:15 p.m., we'll reconvene here. Now we have a busy, intriguing day before us. Let's get started.
And here comes Air Force Number 1, and the President and Mrs. Kennedy have arrived at Dallas Love Field. Then there is Mrs. Kennedy, the First Lady, stepping from the plane, wearing a bright pink suit with a dark fur collar and a matching pink hat, and the President, wearing a dark suit, steps off directly behind. They are being greeted by placards of varying emotion, those saying we're with you all the way, JFK, and those saying help JFK stamp out democracy. So he is seeing Dallas County politics at the height of a very boiling moment.
I came to see the President, and I said to the President, God bless you, and I meant it.
And here comes the President now. In fact, he's not in his limousine. He's reaching across the fence, shaking hands with many of the people who have come here to see him. But this is one of those impromptu moments for which President Kennedy is so well known. So many times you have heard that the Secret Service men suddenly find themselves without the President. The President and Mrs. Kennedy seated on the back seat, Governor and Mrs. Connolly on the jump seats, and the trip to downtown Dallas and the Trade Mart is underway. And here comes Jackie waving by.
My dad loved NCIS. He watched the episodes over and over. He knew the words and the storyline of almost every show. There were other shows like it. CSI and Law and Order were a couple of them. But there was something about that one for my dad. Occasionally, I would watch an episode with him. The good news is that it didn't matter if that particular episode had been on before. I think he may have had as much fun watching it the fourth time as he did the first. My brother Dennis got a chance to watch many more of those episodes than I did. He was there more on the spot to take care of and be with my dad, and it helped so much in those later years. Those episodes first came out in about 2003, and even though it was about 30 years later, it was a far cry from the investigative techniques they featured on the very first crime show that many of us watched, and that I watched as a kid. It was called The FBI. That show premiered in 1965, and it was on, as I recall, every Sunday night, and it featured a guy named Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. What a name. He was a good-looking guy, and he was really great for the FBI brand. And at the end of each episode, it carried a message. As I recall, it might have been from Mr. Hoover himself. The reality was that, well, the science itself at that time was better than the show, even though both were, I don't know, how would I say it, in black and white and not color. Now, in 2020, of course, the truth, well, it's reversed. The shows are truly better than the science. But to be fair, both have improved over the years. Sure, things in the world of forensics have gotten more sophisticated. 2000 was not 1960, and surely 2000 is not 2020. But all of these hit shows that have portrayed forensic science as a magical, near-flawless tool for identifying criminals, well, the truth is that Hollywood's depiction of forensic science is overstated. In 2009, scientists with the National Research Council noted that no forensic method, except for nuclear DNA analysis, can reliably and consistently connect evidence to a specific individual or source. Stop and think about that statement because it's powerful. Also, we have heard a lot about artificial intelligence in the media in the last few years, especially in the world of business, where first-generation AI is beginning to take hold in a myriad of ways and applications. There are implications in criminal science about these kind of technology advances, too. During the Obama administration, President Obama's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology reported that pattern-matching forensic procedures are unreliable. Even more recently, we've seen some fallout from that. In general, that conclusion has ramifications for facial recognition software, and clearly that's an example where inadequacies have been identified. It has ramifications for other technologies, too. Obviously, we have to remember that technology is marching at an ever faster pace, faster than ever before, and what was a problem last year and deemed to be unreliable may indeed rise to the level of DNA reliability in the future. That is the beauty of technological advancement. And look, all of us, we do hope that occurs. Why? Well, it will make the job of everyone involved in investigating and prosecuting a crime easier in one sense. In the end, it'll make it easier for a juror as well. In our country's current social context, this whole topic is the center of an especially important point. The Innocence Project has exonerated many hundreds of wrongfully convicted people, and bad forensic science was found to be a contributing factor in about half of the original cases. That is startling, isn't it? I always heard the saying, listen to the evidence. The evidence doesn't lie. But the truth is, in everyday real life, lots of problems and scenarios put a kink in this theory. These problems and scenarios are not new. 6 years before the National Research Council's 2009 report, one writer talks about his work on a panel of that very same council. That panel looked at a particular forensic technique used to match bullets found at crime scenes, typically murders, to bullets found in a suspect's possession. That procedure, called comparative bullet lead analysis, was first used in the investigation into the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in 1963. What the panel found 40 years after the event contradicted the FBI's analysis of the evidence at that time, and as he tells it, caused the FBI to stop using the technique altogether. Wow. Wonder how many people were convicted in that 40-year period in cases where that type of analysis had a bearing on the outcome. These kind of stories bring us back to the earth when it comes to forensic science. From the lofty goals and lofty places that forensics teases us with, there is always the here and now. What do I mean by that? Well, you can apply neutron activation analysis on a bullet, but if the sheriff who was responsible for the retrieving of that bullet and the safekeeping of that bullet from the moment he found it to the moment it undergoes that test, and during testing, and then responsible for returning it to the evidence room in readiness for the trial, well, all this is otherwise known as the chain of custody. If that sheriff and all of his compadres do not maintain that chain of custody, well then, old school chain of custody problems trump, no pun intended here, new school neutron analysis testing. Simple as that. Well, maybe. It is true that everything you know about a case has to be put into proper context as a juror. What makes documentation and chain of custody even more important in today's world is that we now know, and it's out in the open in a big way in our current society, that law enforcement and prosecutors too, well, between them and amongst them, mistakes are sometimes made, and sadly, sometimes evidence is even tampered with. Now, I am not trying to paint the police or anyone else as bad guys. By and large, and as a whole, they do a yeoman's job of trying to get all this right. And they do, I think, get it right in most cases. And I am sure that in a typical criminal case, there are plenty of antics that can be carried on by both sides, defense and prosecution. But it's 2020, and what we know now in this electronic age is that it wasn't long ago that things weren't always on the up and up, especially in the time of the world when cheating on these type of things could almost be done in broad daylight, and the authorities had a pretty good chance of getting away with it, at least when it came to these types of matters. And that was pretty much up until, well, not long ago. And by the way, the root of a lot of it was chain of evidence custody as well. Thank goodness for the system of justice that we have. The right to a fair trial and to at least show that these kind of things could have occurred, that evidence in a given circumstance might be tainted, that the chain of custody might have been broken, and that you, as a juror, should take these facts into consideration when determining whether you believe beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant committed the crime. Still, when seeking the truth, no one feels good about letting a killer go on a technicality. In a moral sense, the goal is to find the real truth, regardless of the technicalities. Did the defendant commit the crime or not? But the duties of a juror go beyond that. In our system of jurisprudence, it has to be more. There is a higher standard placed on the authorities to prove the guilt of a defendant. The gift that comes to defendants as a result of thousands of years of oppressive behavior by other authorities in other societies that came before. Sound familiar? Back to the Future. Again. You may wonder why I took that wander to begin with. Well, it wasn't just about chain of custody, although chain of custody is a pretty good example since its importance is ubiquitous with all physical evidence. It was really about reinforcing the basic fact that even though the evidence doesn't lie, there are still challenges with physical evidence. It's a scientifically proven fact that relying on the physical evidence isn't always foolproof. Again, for a myriad of reasons. And I think what makes it even more challenging in the JFK case is where there is a full-blown suspicion around the evidence-gathering process itself that was the result of some poor technique displayed in broad daylight by the Dallas police right from the get-go. And then the FBI's whole approach to the case, that it was a lone gunman. So all the evidence, whether it be testimony or physical evidence, would need to conform. What a recipe for introducing problems with what may have been found, and perhaps even found and then altered, and outright boundless suspicion about what may have been simply ignored. And what is most important here is that those most trusted with the fact-finding, well, sometimes they do find themselves in an extraordinary moment where truth is stranger than fiction. Case in point is where the authorities were handed the so-called pristine bullet, which became, rather famously, Commission Exhibit 399. It is only when you are trusted that you can receive such a bullet and such a fact that is so much stranger than fiction is, well, believed. But you know the old saying, lie to me once, and, well, you know the rest. Trust is a hard thing to earn, and even harder to restore when it has been broken. As we begin this portion of the podcast on forensics, I asked myself a similar question as I had done when we began the miniseries on episodes that deal with the Dealey Plaza witnesses and the grassy knoll. This is a rather famous part of the case, particularly the parts that deal with the president's autopsy. And I was concerned that I would have to work very hard to do this part of the podcast real justice. More importantly, to do justice to the JFK assassination story. Well, let me say that a little differently. I am no stranger to working hard, so I wasn't afraid of that. What I am afraid of is not doing the story itself justice. I am satisfied with how we presented the Dealey Plaza witnesses and the grassy knoll story. We didn't get everything, but we got most everything that was material. But honestly, there is a big difference between Dealey Plaza and the knoll and the forensics. Let's face it, I am not an MD, and I am not a forensic pathologist, and I am not a professional investigator or member of law enforcement. No special training to undertake this task. With that very humbling reality platform as a basis for beginning this portion of the storytell, I candidly asked myself two questions over and over that I thought germane to writing and producing these episodes. First, what did I want the reader to come away with out of what is literally a mountain of evidence? How could it be distilled into something relevant and memorable and understandable? And second, what approach could I take in presenting the story that facilitates that same objective without leaving gaping holes in the story itself or gaping technical holes that you can drive a truck through? Again, I humbly submit that I am not an MD or a forensic pathologist or an investigator or law enforcement official. None of the above. Just a juror like you. Well, like the camping trip I described in our last episode, I knew that I was going to have to rely on whatever skills that I do have and not worry about the skills that I don't have. Use what I have to do the best job I can for all of you in telling this part of the story. In the business roles that I have undertaken over the years, as I moved to progressively more responsible roles, I really came to understand rather clearly that it was an executive's role to simplify things, not make them more complicated. It was my role to receive and sift through the endless complexity and find the clear simplicity of it all. Remove the chaos and restore the order to the thoughts and the approach to defining and solving problems, with the understanding that the details still matter and, indeed, control the reality of the outcome. That concept eventually became a tenet of my own thinking and writing on the everyday basis in the world that I existed in for so many years. I didn't always practice that with perfection, but I came to understand it deeply over the years. Simply put, it's simplification and not complication. So with that in mind, I am undertaking this next phase with a great dose of humility and excitement all at the same time. I hope when we finish with this portion of the storytell that we can look back at it and say that it deserves a place on the bookshelf that is right next to the other work we've done so far in this podcast series, and that it represents the subject matter well, that it adequately, objectively, and appropriately tells this part of the JFK assassination story. I am sure that it will reinforce why, one day last year, I decided to give this podcast the title, JFK, The Enduring Secret. The remainder of this podcast today outlines and weaves together into a synopsis of sorts the areas that we will most definitely cover in the area of forensics. I am sure it will change a bit as we go, but you have to start with a roadmap on this part of the journey. And when you cross the desert, going straight is the fastest way to get to the oasis on the other side. Heck, we may end up in Palm Springs for a minute or two. Doesn't Frank Sinatra live there? He's got to have a place in this story somewhere. Oh well, remember from the very beginning, I promised you a podcast with a wander, and every wander that we have taken has had some significance to this story, especially if you know me, or just truly want to understand the JFK story a little deeper than you otherwise would. You have to listen carefully, though, so please do be patient and stay tuned for a smashing series of episodes up next. Oh, and not to get too far ahead of myself, but after the forensics, it's off to explore Lee Harvey Oswald and the murky world that he most certainly lived in. 1 foot in one place and 1 foot in another. Who was he exactly? And as one listener said to us on the blog not long ago, perhaps the key to the whole thing at this stage is truly understanding who Lee Harvey Oswald was. Really was. My gosh, you can't make this stuff up, can you? So, without further ado, let's listen to the rest of episode 51. The story of the autopsy is filled with stuff that I often call jet fuel for the conspiracy theorists. Some of it, but certainly not all of it, may be true. What makes that part scary is that all the actors in that part of the play are basically government actors. I don't have to explain the ramifications to that. It's self-evident, I think. But the obvious takeaway is that Lee Harvey Oswald can shoot the president, or a group of mobsters can shoot the president, or a group of rogue CIA agents can shoot the president, or even some combination thereof can shoot the president. And it's still just a conspiracy about the shooting. But when folks begin to take action afterward, during the official investigation, it's now a conspiracy involving a cover-up. And for a long time, when the official working premise of conspiracy experts was that it was a coup d'etat, and overthrow of the existing government, many conceived a circumstance where it was all intertwined. One big cover-up executed under one big master plan, because it was a coup d'etat. A cover-up of the shooting conspiracy, and then a squashing and a cover-up of the investigation afterward. That may be true. But the more popular theory today is that the cover-up of the investigation may very well have been well-intentioned based on the federal government's knowledge about Oswald and the true facts behind who ordered it. or at the very least, fear about who might have ordered it, and the consequences to world peace if the true answer had ever been revealed. Perhaps it is the reason today for the still ongoing hesitation to disclose all of the required documents under the JFK Act. That was a bit of a wander, but again, an important one. And remember, understanding the motives of each group involved is clearly part of evaluating the evidence that is tied to each of them, and that you have before you for evaluation. Let us start by trying to develop some construct for what the forensic evidence should be helping us to figure out. I am going to use an approach which enumerates various topics in order for me to keep track of them all, and as we progress through them episode by episode. Number 1. The evidence surrounding ownership and possession of the rifle, the Mannlicher Carcano rifle. Was it really Oswald's? Does it really tie back to other gunshot evidence gathered at the crime scene? Number 2. The fingerprint and other evidence such as the paraffin tests related to that same rifle. Fingerprint and other evidence that indicates whether Lee Harvey Oswald handled the rifle around the time of the shooting and whether he may have fired the weapon. Number 3. The evidence around the 3 spent cartridges that were retrieved that day on the 6th floor and what they reveal to investigators, including how they match up with other evidence and how chain of custody comes into play. Number 4. Oswald's capability with a gun and the likelihood that Oswald or anyone with similar marksman capabilities could make that shot from the window with that particular rifle. What the government and certain news agencies did after the fact to try and recreate that shot and study the effects related to the use of a Mannlicher Carcano rifle. On this one, we won't plow new ground on anything that we have already gone over in previous episodes. And on this one, I stress that we will always live in a world of probabilities. Even a blind squirrel finds a nut every once in a while. Whether Oswald was a good shot and whether the Carcano was good enough, well, we all know that that shot was possible, regardless of what the answers are to the latter 2 questions. So the real question is it more likely or is it less likely? Or could it be that it is highly possible? Or could it be that it is not even remotely possible? You get my drift. This question, it is not a yes or no answer. It is not a 100% certainty, nor is it a 100% uncertainty. Number 5, the damage to the presidential limousine and what that damage tells us about the origin of at least some of the shots, and how that evidence impacts the conclusions on whether 4 or more shots were fired that day, making it a de facto shooting conspiracy. Within this topic, we'll ask the question about the damage to the presidential limousine's windshield and whether that damage points to a shot which may have come from a direction other than the schoolbook depository. Number 6. Along with looking at the limousine itself, we will look at the recovery of bullet fragments from the limousine and how that plays into both the lone gunman and single bullet theory, and the bullet count and the chance that there was a shot taken from the front. Number 7. The extent to which any of the evidence at the autopsy indicates that a shot came from anywhere other than the schoolbook depository. A shot from anywhere else, from any other angle of approach, that would indicate fire from another location. Remember, just one more bullet conforming to that fact, that is all it takes, and that indicates a shooting conspiracy. The rest of the mechanical details of the autopsy are, frankly, a means to an end, to get this simple conclusion or refute it. Confirm it or refute it based on what side of the story you're on, of course. Number 8. The extent to which any of the evidence in the autopsy, when combined with the missed shot that hit Tag, points to 3 or more bullets hitting the limousine or its passengers. Evidence that translates into 4 bullets or more in total, as I've just said, and thus a shooting conspiracy. The commission's contention is that 2 shots hit Kennedy and Comley, the magic bullet, and then, of course, the final and fatal shot to the back of President Kennedy's head. Number 9. The statements, stories, and testimony of the doctors and other clinicians who attended to the president at Parkland Hospital and inside Trauma Room 1 in the vain attempt to save him, and how that testimony compares and contrasts to the official autopsy findings. Number 10. The struggle for possession of the president's body and the fantastic stories surrounding the chain of evidence related to it, and how that impacts the notion and probability that someone might have altered the president's body prior to the autopsy for the purpose of obscuring the autopsy information. This topic has been given a lot of airtime in the world of JFK assassination lore, and it's been done by some fairly credible people at moments. So it's one we'll want to look at closely. Number 11. The search for other ballistics evidence in the plaza. Why? Well, any evidence of other shots of any kind coming from any type of gun gives a strong indication that the Mannlicher Carcano found on the 6th floor could then not be the only gun involved, and thus a shooter conspiracy. Number 12. A special look at the pristine bullet given its juxtaposition as a linchpin in the single bullet theory and its almost unbelievable story of discovery. The simple question of bullet weight loss as it traveled through the body mass of the president and Governor Conley, leaving fragments during that journey, fragments that simply do not add up. Today, the known fragments weigh more than weight lost by this bullet. Wow, there is a long list of things that the forensics should weigh in on. Not just these, but these are most of the big ones and certainly a good start. As a juror, I would ask that you weigh in on these and make a comment on the blog if you want to hear about other topics that are covered in this forensic discussion. There is still time to call other witnesses and get their take on other topics. Many of these topics will be interwoven into the story we tell about the president's ride to Parkland and what happened that day at the hospital and then his ensuing trip back to Washington. Still others will be addressed as we tell the story of the autopsy. Even though I have broken these down today and enumerated them, my goal is to still tell as much of this in story form as I can. We all know it's more enjoyable that way, and it's easier to tie it all together, too. Our next episode is a dive right in. Join us as the presidential limousine races to Parkland in the vain attempt to save the life of a slain president. Thank you for listening to episode 51 of JFK, The Enduring Secret.